Okay, all right, cool. In the programming language Olympus, computation happens through the will of the gods. Its virtual machine is not a series of memory cells or registers, but rather Mount Olympus itself, with gods who just might carry out programmatic activity if they find you deserving. Now, Olympus began as this image. It's just a line of code. I'll read it aloud. It says, Father Zeus, defender of cities, defender of homes, defender of the traveler and of those far from home, please create a loop counting from 99 to 1 called beer loop. Now, at first I thought I was happy to just leave this unimplemented, as the image seemed to capture the idea on its own, and how much more could we really learn by implementing it as a full language? But I decided to make the language anyway and just see what happens. Really, the reason I went further with this is because I felt there was more here than just dressing up code in religious costume. That there was something about the engagement between natural language and code, complicated by the formality of prayer, and the way it questions the power dynamic between programmer and machine. So I went ahead and made a working language. Now, technically, I think we can decide that this is an esoteric language because it doesn't particularly make it easy to understand code's performance. It views the attempt to translate human intent into logical steps as a kind of hubris, kind of the central sin in Greek mythology. And I wrote about esolangs for about 10 years on my blog, Esoteric Codes. One thing about Olympus is that it's written in this kind of pseudo-natural language. And natural language and code have this kind of long and often antagonistic relationship. This quote at the top is from Mark Marino's excellent book, Critical Code Studies. He says, writing programs in a natural language, whether spoken or written, has been a dream of programmers perhaps since the advent of the digital state machine. Now, I would argue that, although that's true, it's perhaps been more the dream of managers than coders. Marino here is describing Flowmatic, which was an influential language by Admiral Grace Hopper that helped shape COBOL among many other languages. But Hopper, a Navy admiral, wanted to make code more accessible to vice presidents or a colonel or an admiral. And it's perhaps an early entry in this idea of having business analysts write code with natural language tools to eventually bypass programmers entirely. And we've seen this idea come back like clockwork with the beginning of Visual Basic to sort of no code and the AI-assisted programming that we have now, which are all perfectly fine, except the idea that it's somehow going to replace the work of crafting code. Mark Zuckerberg has suggested, however jokingly, that perhaps programmers won't make more than $10 an hour in the future because AI will be doing all the work, as if this will somehow overcome the struggle of translating human intent into logic at the heart of programming. Now, of course, we're here personifying the interpreter as a series of gods, and this can invoke the ELIZA effect, which is when we momentarily, however fleetingly, read a software system, something that we know is software as sentient. And it's something that we're most familiar with now when we lose patience with digital assistants, which can be very uncomfortable because they're these subservient systems and we sound like assholes when we yell at them. And this generates a new round of think pieces every few years. But Olympus flips this power dynamic. We bother the gods with our petty requests, and really, how can our requests not seem petty to them? But now we speak with adoration and respect. We state what we want, but we know the machine might not do what we want. Zeus is, of course, free to ignore us if he wishes and owes us no explanation. He's not accountable to us. The illusion that we command the machine is gone. It's really the gods and the machine that are in control. And as John Waters says, prayer is begging. And perhaps this begging better reflects our actual power dynamic with technology. Also, it should be noticed that experts have said that robots are now better at worship than we are. This says, robots, unlike people, are spiritually incorruptible. So here is that line of code again in Olympus, kind of broken down into parts. A line of code is not a command, but an invocation, which is a petition for help. An invocation has several pieces: the adoration, the supplication, and one or more requests, which are roughly the commands of the language. The adoration is a call to the particular god. This is their name and a series of epithets, which are phrases that celebrate or praise the god. Now, each god has their own list of epithets, and you have to get them right and not reuse them too frequently, or the god will get mad and ignore you. So for Zeus, first we say Lord Zeus, speak his name, then we have to use at least 4 epithets. We can call him defender of homes, father of the gods, and several more. But if we were praying to Ariadne, we would say mistress of the serpents, or perhaps goddess who turns and turns and turns again until the way is clear. Finally, we have our actual request, which of course reads as this kind of micromanaging, do this specific thing and then that specific thing. But that is, of course, what programming is. Now, this line of code is particularly bold. We're declaring a function and assigning a print statement that has a lot of parts. And it seems like we're just on the verge of what will cause Zeus to lose his temper. This is what the code behind Olympus looks like. It's in JavaScript. It's using PEG.js, which is a parsing expression grammar. And I feel like pegs are somewhat out of style at the moment, but they're perfect for these wordy languages like Olympus. And you can kind of see at the top here, we have all the different epithets for Zeus spelled out. Now, Zeus has a praise factor, which is sort of like the level of ego that god has. Zeus is higher than some of the others. But the good thing about Zeus is that there's an alternative you can call on Athena for pretty much anything that you call Zeus for. Both of them are the strategists who deal with structural things like opening blocks of code. So they have a lot of overlap in terms of how we use them. Now, if we want to declare a variable, we would do that through Mnemosyne, who is the holder of tales, old and new, mistress of memory. And you'll notice here that, so we're creating a vessel called beer string, that's a variable, and placing within it the missive bottles of beer. You can see that we use the word and a lot, and that already creates a certain amount of structural ambiguity. So if you and 2 things together, is it 2 different commands? Is it 2 variables as part of an expression? It's not always clear. And this naturally limits how much you can say in one line of code and kind of prevents you from sort of overrunning in a way that will really kind of piss off that god. Ariadne, mistress of the labyrinth and the serpent, deals with branching structures. So that's if, case, break, and the calling of a function. Here we're asking her to create a check, and a check is just a truth condition. In this case, we have an if statement connected to it, but we don't actually say what the truth condition is. We're saying create a check called check99 with parameter x to call printbot. So it's this if condition based on a truth condition that we haven't described yet. We're going to describe it later by going back to this check99 and assigning something to it. And in this way, we kind of skip about the surface of the program, adding functions and blocks of code where we please, all out of order. We create a function and we decorate it by adding additional commands. We can add additional parameters as well through currying. And this kind of breaks the local narrativity of code, where lines of code are no longer grouped because they run in sequence or are part of the same abstraction, but instead organized by reverence, treating each god as a resource and not burdening them or asking them too much back to back. Now, when we want to close a block of code, we call on Hades to collect the souls of variables no longer needed. It's what's called a garbage collection in other languages. Artemis and Demeter, who rule over the cycles of nature, are the masters of looping structures and repetition. Hermes, the bringer of dreams, is responsible for all random numbers. And as the messenger of the gods, he deals with input and output. Aphrodite transforms the ideal plane into the physical world, which is the equivalent of eval in Olympus. Now, some people might ask, why is this sort of in this kind of strange variation of a procedural language? Why didn't we go for something that sort of embraces the classical beauty associated with ancient Greece, the Platonic solids and golden spiral, and those principles of design that find their ultimate expression in the Yahoo logo? Wouldn't what we have look more like a Lisp language where everything is balanced and eternal in a kind of declarative functional model? And I would argue that that's really Plato's view of the gods, and that Olympus is not a Platonic language. It belongs to the kind of petty, tempestuous Homeric gods. Also, there's already too much pretend elegance in code, which I kind of see as the curse of mathematicians' influence on computer science. We can pretend to be clear thinking, but we're not ultimately logical beings. And most programs that we write fall short of this. Nearly all have bugs, places where our logic falls short. And that's something I want to embrace with Olympus. Now, we open and close programs by calling on the deathless gods to hearken to our prayer. And at the very end of the program, we end with, "O great gods, with all the splendor of Olympus, sing the song of 99 bottles of beer on the wall," finally declaring the name of our program. So that is Olympus. I have actually, I know it's probably bad form to have two QR codes on the same screen, but I actually wrote a full Olympus paper that's supposed to be paywalled, but it isn't yet. So if anyone wants to read it, it's the one on the left. On the right is my mailing list. And I just want to mention that I'm working on a book. It's coming out next year of 44 different esolangs, including Olympus, with MIT Press, coming out sometime next year. So if that interests you at all, you can email me or sign up for the mailing list there. Thank you very much.